Hi, and welcome to the Sierra Bible Church Sermon of the Week. We hope you enjoy this message by Pastor Nathan Levering.
My name is Nate. I'm one of the pastors around here, and it's a privilege to be together, to point our hearts toward the Lord, to seek to be an encouragement, and so fun already. And Kathy and I, my wife, spent a few moments just even a minute ago saying, just checking in after a number of conversations of people that are in this house and were here earlier. And our summation was this: life is just super, super hard sometimes. You know, and I mean, things just come at us. Sometimes it's emotional. Sometimes it's, just literally the world and all kinds of different things. And so my hope is that from the moment you come on this campus to the time you leave, as we walk out what it looks like to live lives in God's incredible story, that we would be exposed to a good God who's written us in, who invites us to play a vital part in what he's doing. We would experience his goodness as he invites us to be a part of what he's doing in the world. And part of that is just putting our arms around each other when we have a chance to gather, whether it's in life groups or here, or just being an encouragement. And so I hope that's what we get to experience together. Some 6 weeks ago, we started a series called The Story of God. Started it with week 0, so we're on week 5. Next week would be the week, if you're wondering, like, man, when would be a good time to invite those people I've been thinking about, maybe talking to the Lord about or praying about? Bring them next week, because we're going to roll that big old cross back out, and we are going to celebrate the victory that is ours in Christ, as we do every week. But in the story, next week we get to Jesus. We've been trying to take a look, kind of a 30,000-foot view of the story of God to better understand this author that's writing the greater, bigger story, that we might live our lives with integrity to who he is, and then that we might see our lives, the moments, the times, the seasons that God's given us as a part of what God is writing in all of human history. And how do we write that well? How do we live these lives in a way that would honor God and would move his story a little closer to his intent as the author? And so we've been asking all sorts of questions. We've been trying to frame out the story of the Bible. We started in Genesis 1 some 5 weeks ago, and we've said there's a number of different ways we can think about these things. And the one way that we've been looking at this is kind of this 4-act play, that the act 1 starts just in the first 2 chapters of the story, where God, in his goodness, in his wisdom, and in his power, creates. I loved the question I got as I made my way out to the Commons last week by, I think, a 10-year-old daughter of one of you. And she said, hey, my dad told me I need to ask you this question: who created God? And I was like, I just love your parents, they send you to me. I said, that's why we hired Rachel. She's actually in charge of answering these questions for children. So, but God creates, and he shows up on the scene. He writes us in right to the story, and yet he puts us into this incredible garden, this beautiful place in which he's desired for us to be in rich relationship with him. To experience a sort of love and dynamic to our human relationships of which we've known very little, and then to be in relationship with the gifts, the skills, the passion that God's given us in our world, that we would make much of what he's given us and bring glory ultimately to God. And yet Act 2 comes in just the 3rd chapter of the first book by way of a serpent showing up. And in his temptation and our rebellion, we fall. We would rather be God, make our own decisions, than find ourselves under his authority. And so we rebel. God then kicks us out of the garden with a curse and a promise. That he's a God that is faithful to his promises. He will act, he will step in, that as far as things get, as dark as things get, as confusing as they may spiral downhill, I will step in. I'm not done. And ultimately my victory will be won. And so in the 12th chapter of the book of Genesis, as we've looked, God steps in with a kind of focused intention to a man named Abraham. And so you get from Abraham up to Jesus, God's beginning of his story of redemption in the nation of Israel as God steps into Abraham's life, an older man at this time without any children, and says, through your incredible family, to which Abraham's looking around like, yeah, Sarah and I are still here. He says, I'm going to build a nation. And in and through that nation will come the Savior of the world, and your nation will actually be a blessing to all nations. This is the story that God is writing in the part, Abraham, that you have to play. And what we've said a couple different times now, and we can look at this again for a moment, is that we can see God's story of redemption through the nation of Israel on our hand. It's kind of a fun little way to get the pieces straight and the timing straight. And so we have it here. It's in your bulletin too. But one thing that we can begin to understand if we just look at our hand is that if our pinky, this might be a little almost like sacrilegious to some of us, but if our pinky, we're in church, so it's okay. If our pinky is Jesus is over here. Abraham is our thumb. Abraham existed about as far the other side of Jesus as we exist this side of Jesus, right? So about 2,000 years ago, God calls Abraham to be the father of the nation through whom he's going to change everything in the apex of the story, namely Jesus. Now, Abraham eventually has a son named Isaac. This family becomes a larger family, which eventually becomes a nation in slavery. And then God steps into the world in a burning bush and says to Moses, I want you to go back to Pharaoh, set my people free. And God sets a deliverer up in the name of Moses. He's our next finger. About 500 years later, Moses passes the baton off in some stories we looked at a couple weeks ago to a man by the name of Joshua. And Joshua then takes God's people into about 400 years in which they're ruled by judges or really rulers. And so that's this next sort of piece in here, about 400 years. And then as we looked at last week, the nation of Israel thinks, yeah, this is okay, but we'd really like to be like all the other kingdoms, on earth. We'd like their prestige. We'd like their, and so they cry out to God and they're like, God, give us a king. Really, they cry out to God's leaders and say, give us a king. And so Joshua goes to, Samuel goes to God and says, hey, the people want a king. Should we give them a king? And he's, frustrated at this point. God's like, hey, the people aren't ignoring you as a judge. They're ignoring me as the rightful king. And so God allows them to pick a king. They choose the first king. His name is Saul. He's pretty much a disaster. Eventually, God picks David. He's sort of a disaster, but he is a man after God's own heart as he repents, what we looked at last week. And then one of David's sons by the name of Solomon is the last of the three kings as a part of the united kingdom that is Israel. So that's where we're going to pick up our story, because if we have Abraham, Moses, David, eventually we're going to get over here to Ezra and Nehemiah. And most of us know these stories. But we go from Solomon through what's called the divided kingdom in our Bibles. And most of us kind of get lost at this point. I mean, there's some minor prophets, some major prophets. There's kingdoms, there's wars, there's tribes getting lost, and the whole thing gets a little confusing. So I'm going to try my best to clarify some of that for us. We'll land in a couple of the stories and see what God has for us. So if we're going to get from David through the divided kingdom, this is what it looks like. I'll need some help. So here we go. The last of our kings was named, what? Solomon. Thank you. He gets an S. Solomon, he led the last of the United Kingdoms. United things do what united things do when sin and pride enters and they divide. We end up then with a divided kingdom. And there's a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. They're named this because one went north, the other went south. In the northern kingdom, this is the 10 tribes. The southern kingdom, just 2 tribes. Let's take the northern kingdom first. It goes okay like this, and then it goes like that into We have no idea. The northern kingdom is ruled by one of Solomon's generals named Jeroboam. So Jeroboam, he's the first of 19 kings in the northern kingdom. This is that part of your Bible where you're like, really? Really? Are they really that bad? Oh, they got worse than really bad? And so of the 19 kings in the northern kingdom, any guesses as to how many righteous kings? 6? 1? You guys are really close. 0. None. None are righteous. So it doesn't take long before the Assyrians come in. They conquer. This is where Isaiah's in here. Isaiah, if you're trying to piece together the Bible. And then the 10 tribes just literally go off into oblivion, never to be heard of again. Until we try and figure out how Israel's a nation, which has been a popular conversation in the last few months. So people tried to do a bunch of stuff with this that's somewhat confusing, but it's helpful to know your biblical history. So that's the northern kingdom. Those 10 tribes go off that way. 2 tribes go south with King Rehoboam. Now, King Rehoboam is one of Solomon's sons, and they have 20 kings in the southern kingdom. Guesses on how many were righteous? 8. Are they up there now? They're up there. How was 0 up there? None of you even got that right. All right. It's one of those Sundays. I'm with you. So you guys are amazing. Way to go. 8. You can read. There's 8 righteous kings. They last a little bit longer. And then eventually they are conquered as a result of their desire to be like and worship like the kingdoms around them, their neighbors. And God says, okay, if you're going to worship like that, I'm going to put you in a version of time out that is the nation of Babylon, eventually the nation of Persia. And it's in this time when the nation of Israel, which is just at this point 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. Benjamin's a small tribe. Judah is a big, larger, kind of more significant tribe. When the nation of Israel comes to be known as Jews. And so the top 10 tribes are literally never even known as Jews, but the top 2 are, as the Babylonians and the Persians come in and conquer the nation, carrying off all version of religious artifact. God then eventually allows them, and some of you know these stories, to return back to Jerusalem, restore the kingdom, restore the priesthood, restore the wall and the city and the worship, because Jesus is coming back. And he gets his people ready for what must have felt like the longest 400 years of silence. After, there's 3 names in here, and I think they're on the fill-in too. The one is Zerubbabel, and he went back to Jerusalem and rebuilt the temple. Ezra was a priest, and he went back and established a priesthood. And then Nehemiah, one that we're familiar with, especially if you're with us last fall, as we walked through the book together, he went back to Jerusalem and eventually establishes the wall and the protection and sort of the national identity of God's people in Jerusalem. So that's how we can kind of piece these 2 together. We get then Zerubbabel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and then 400 years of silence before God then steps in, still as a part of his redemption, into a little town in the outskirts of Jerusalem named Bethlehem. And it's on that night, and a baby, and a time we worship as Christmas, when Jesus stepped foot into the planet, the apex of the entire story. The word that was there at the beginning in creation has put on flesh, John tells us, steps into our story to do what none of us have been able to do, to live the life we were created to live, to eventually walk that walk to the cross, to pay the penalty that our sin deserved. And then 3 days later, he would rise from the grave, proclaiming victory over and in sin and death. You remember the scene when Jesus is on the cross? And Jesus is there, he's paying for our punishment, he's taking the whole deal. God, the Father, has turned his back, and Jesus is crying out, and he's there at his death. And there's this interesting conversation between the 2 thieves that hang on either side of Jesus. One thief, he's mocking Jesus. Why don't you climb down? I thought you were a king. I thought you were this great person. Why don't you save yourself? And by the way, we'd like saving too. The other thief seems like he's watched or been tuned in or more attentive to what God is actually up to. And he says, like, how could you mock this man? We're here because of things we've done. He's here taking care of what others have done. And then Jesus, in this conversation, looks at him and he says some fascinating words. He says, truly, very truly, it's as if Jesus looks into the eyes of this man on the moments of his death, probably with very little remorse at one level for a life lived in one direction. And he says to him, because of the faith you're putting in me, the Son of God, given to bear your sin, today, he says, you will be with me. And it's fascinating what it says after that. I think he says, you'll be with me in paradise, which really is in a garden. So the garden we started in, the garden you were kicked out of, the garden you were created for, we're going back. This is the story that the author is writing, and as a result of your faith in me, and it's true for us this morning, that promise is ours. And so Jesus invites him then into the kingdom that he'd been talking much of. While Jesus was here, he said some interesting words through people like us. He said, just as the Father has sent me into the world with a purpose, with a plan, with a position as his child, so I, Jesus says, am sending you into this world to be salt and to be light, to have a purpose, to have a plan, to have a position as his children. This is what it's about. And Jesus launches the church. He sends the Spirit of God to live within us, to guide and encourage and comfort and walk us into the very plans the author has scripted for us. I mean, it's an incredible story, right? And then Act 4, after the church has done its best, we'll say, Jesus is coming back. Jesus is coming back. Well, this morning we're pulling out all the stops around here. And so, we got some extra lighting. I need a volunteer. Okay, Ron, you're a volunteer. This is how you volunteer at Sierra Bible Church. You sit up front. So can you head all the way to the wall? Keep going, Ron. Thank you. So this is just a picture for us of what we've been talking a little bit about. So over here, Ron's hands, which I'm going to have him hold, is a little green flag that signifies creation. Then we have a little bit of electrical tape that signifies sin entering the world. And then we got about, 8 or so chapters of chaos, human deterioration, until God steps in 2,000 years, the other side of Jesus in the person of Abraham. Good. I know it's right on the tip of most of your tongues. Abraham, right? Remember 2,000 years? We're there. There we go. Abraham starts this story of redemption that's walked out in the nation of Israel. And eventually, if the average age of a human being is about 77 and a half years, what it is now, between Abraham and Isaac to Jesus, there's about 26 generations. And if each generation is signified by about 6 inches on our rope, this is about how far it would take. So God's plan continues to move forward. The apex of that story is Jesus giving his life for us, and then enter the church. And if I have my way, which I may, after Easter, we're going to do some of this section of the story because I think it's fascinating with lots to learn. But somewhere down here, that's heaven. Somewhere down here, 26 more generations from the day Jesus stood on this earth is a very important generation. You know why this one matters so much? Anybody want to guess? Because it's yours. It's your generation. 26. From Jesus to the day you were born. This is your story. This is the chapter that God has leaned in and said, right, join my purpose in what I'm doing in human history. Pick up your pen with everything that I've given you and write it well. This one matters because it's yours. It's mine. We don't know how long it is. Most of us probably have some idea of when it started. But we're not sure. At some point, the end of our story will be bookended by a face-to-face with Jesus, and eternity will start at that point. We don't know if that's our last day of breath on this earth or if it's when Jesus returns. Prior to that, I think I'd go for the latter, but we don't get to choose as far as I could tell. And we want to live that life in light of what's out here too, in light of the future self, in light of what God is inviting us to become, that we would pull the goodness of how God's created us to live into our present time. God's future hope, God's future joy, God's future healing. This is what it looks like to live that well. We pull that into our present day as we seek to live out the one generation that ought to matter most to us because it's ours. Paul said some fascinating words when he tried to encourage us, I think, along these lines in Ephesians. Thank you, Ron. You don't have to stand there all service. Ron's like, what am I doing over here? Paul said these words, and I want us to consider them this morning. Paul said, be very careful then how you live. Not as, you can just leave that there, Ron. It's going to be super distracting for me, at least, if you pull. Be very careful then, Paul says, how you live. Not as unwise, but as wise. Pay attention to the 6 inches, God willing. Making then, he says, the most of every opportunity. The literal language here is redeeming or buying back the time. The word for time here is kairos. It's a word that means buy back the season that you're in, the moment that you're in, this place in time where you find your story right now. Buy that back. He says, because these days are evil. In other words, they're going to be gone. Therefore, do not be foolish. Don't live like the foolish, but understand what the Lord's will, his plan, his authorship is for you to live well in your season. And this, for us, is the invitation. What does it look like in a world that oftentimes can come at us with a version of kind of insane busyness that seems to numb our hearts to the will of God? Or a world that just creates another sort of mind-numbing, frivolous activity. Thank you, places like Netflix, where we can just waste an exorbitant amount of time. And we go, well, there went another inch. And there went another. And Paul leans in and he says, pay attention to the season you're in. Live it as one that is wise. Buy back the time you have. And I want to look at a couple of lives because they help us get some direction in what this looks like. And they happen to be some sort of infamous stories, at least to many of us, that are right here in this Jewish captivity in Babylon and in Persia. The first story in this seeking to understand these things happens about 600 years BC. And it happens through the person of Daniel. Many of us know Daniel's story. Daniel is a guy that had an incredibly unique role as he lived that out. If we're going to live our lives wisely, tuned in to what God is doing as the author of all time, what that will look like is learning to ask and respond to questions about our very real lives. See, wisdom asks us questions. It's one of the reasons Jesus, 300 plus times, he didn't come and say, take a right, take a left, take a right, take a left. He said, learn to live wisely. And this is what wisdom does. It invites us to consider, and I want us to consider this morning. The first question we want to consider here before we jump into Daniel is this, that wisdom asks, in what areas of my life can I extend godly influence? What's God given me? And I want you to consider that this morning. If you're sitting next to a wife or a husband, that's part of the story. If If you dropped off kids in promised, that's part of the story. If you got some storage in a bank account, that's part of the story. If you work a job and you're tied into relationships with people, that's part of the story. What is it? What are the areas in your life in which, and I'm not saying or suggesting that you do, but if you did, you could extend godly influence because of your role or leadership or influence in those places. What are those places? So it's about 600 BC. Babylon, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, makes their way up to Jerusalem, besieges the city, and pulls off some of the best and brightest Israelites. Now, one of these was the aforementioned Daniel. Daniel gets held even closer to the king's heart because he can interpret dreams. This is very important to a king that is troubled regularly by dreams. So Daniel can tell dreams, and so Nebuchadnezzar is getting a bunch of dreams, and Daniel's the guy. And so at one point, Nebuchadnezzar has this troubling dream. Seems like he's up all night, and it's this interesting dream. And so he calls Daniel in and says, hey, I know because it seems like God's at work in you, even though, we kind of took down the temple and we kind of took the artifacts out. Somehow God's still alive and present in you. And so he calls Daniel out to tell him what the dream means. And so as Nebuchadnezzar leans in, he says, Daniel, here was the dream. Man, it started out with this enormous, beautiful tree. It's like a stunning tree. This tree provided shade to all kinds of people under it, and it produced just the sweetest of fruit that people enjoyed. But a voice came from heaven in the dream, Daniel, and the voice said this, it said, chop down the tree. So the tree was toppled over, and then I woke up being troubled. And so as he tells Daniel the dream, he says, can you tell me what it means? Daniel's like, he's kind of hemming and hawing. He's not quite sure. Nebuchadnezzar's like, Daniel, I know you know what this means. Like, can you tell me what it means? Like, you're the tree. Nebuchadnezzar's like, what? What did the dream mean? And he leans in to Nebuchadnezzar and he says this, you are the tree. And what God is saying is that you've been given by him a pretty incredible amount of influence, Nebuchadnezzar. But it's not really yours. You're acting a bit entitled. You kind of act like it's your wisdom that earned the things you currently have, but it's not. And what God is saying in your areas of influence is that God is about ready to take those back unless and until, and this is where we pick up the story in Daniel chapter 4, you acknowledge this one thing, that the Most High, that is the God I serve, is sovereign. He's in charge. He's the real author of this story. The Most High is sovereign. You're not, Nebuchadnezzar, the king. He's the true king. And until you acknowledge that and that he is sovereign over all kingdoms, what you've been given was given from him and for him. And he gives them to anyone he wishes. And Daniel steps into Nebuchadnezzar's world, and I think steps into ours, and says in those areas of influence, there are some things we need to know if we're going to step into these areas of life that God invites us to extend his influence. And it's these things. These are fill-ins if you want to fill these out. He says this, influence is a stewardship. That you've been given, you didn't earn this. I mean, maybe you worked hard, great. Maybe you got an education, great. But it's here because God gave it to you. It's temporary. In other words, it will all be gone someday, and it could all be gone today. He says, and we're accountable. We're not accountable for the outcomes. We're accountable to be faithful within the story. with the things that God has given us. It's our opportunity. It's our story. We must understand, if we're going to live well in these areas of influence that God's given us, that there's stewardship there from him. I tell you, there's some mornings when I drive to church and I shake the whole way to church. I never used to do that in my old job. But now that I have to stand up in front and this is a part of like what God's invited me into, thankfully I live close. I told Kat, like, we got to stay close because sometimes I get nervous and it's hard and it's tough. And I think, God, maybe I'm going to turn around this morning. And yet I go, no, it's a stewardship. It's really nothing I earned. I didn't fight my way. I didn't maneuver my way. God has given, just like he's given your areas of influence. He can take them away someday and he will. But until he does, what does it look like to step in? Reminding it's a gift from him changes everything. Say, well, okay, God, it's yours then. And we can walk out a sense of living accountable to the opportunities God's put in our day. Our influence is a stewardship. It's temporary, and we are accountable. Two more questions that I think this next story helps us ask. And again, wisdom causes us to ask of our lives, why in the world am I right here? Why am I here? Like the details, the stuff, the medical condition you're struggling with, the relationships that are shattered or beautiful, whatever's hanging out in the bank accounts or the education or the experiences. God, why am I here? And then what is God asking me to do now? Now, I don't know if you've ever kind of gone to that marriage conference and the couples up there. I mean, they just look awesome, you know, and they're super funny. They make marriage seem so easy and wonderful. And I'm sitting there thinking, man, even I want to get married, you know, now. And I have been married for 20 years. But, you know, it's like you walk out the door and you're kind of like, maybe I should introduce them to my husband. Or maybe you read the parenting book and you're like, these people are brilliant. And then you find out at the back of the book, they don't even have children, but they figured out how to do it. Like, I got to admit that church must feel like that, right, at times? That God shows up in a burning bush. He speaks to the pastor people and the elder people. They follow him around by fire at night and clouds during the day. We used to play a game when I was a kid called I Spy, and we'd get together as a family, as a pastor's kid. This is what we did in our family, and we just were on the lookout for God in our lives. And, there's three of us kids, and generally there was some, huge miracle each of us had seen every day. Or not. It was just simple, right? And so God invites us then to see within our very real lives and these amazing stories that are a part of his redemption, our own stories. And what can sometimes feel like this, could God actually still use me? And I don't know, God's never shown up in a burning bush to me. He's never spoken to me. He's never called me like he called Abraham. Can he still use me? Does he know my history? Does he know the wanderings of my heart? And this next story that we're going to walk through, just again, real quickly, is one of the most brilliant stories. And it's an entire book of the Bible in which God is never mentioned by name. There is no I am showing up. There's no Yahweh that speaks out of heaven. There's a story with a bunch of incredible little details in which God's story is woven in. You could call them coincidences, but when looked at from our perspective, we would say, well, absolutely God's a part of that story. Absolutely he could use that person. And then sometimes we reflect on our own lives and we think, I don't know. I don't know if he could use me. I don't know if I've sort of outsinned my good. I think he can save me, but I'm not sure he can use me. And the story of Esther steps into that place and talks to us clearly and loudly about God's work in our world. In the story of Esther, this story happens in and under the Persian Empire, and it sort of picks up where the Persian king decides for himself that he needs an upgrade in the wife category. And so he has a beauty pageant, gets all the beautiful young girls to come to his palace, fixes them up. This one Jew by the name of Esther wins the beauty pageant. What she wins in the beauty pageant is a little trial sleepover in the king's house. She seems to pass that test too. It's at that point where we go, I'm not sure she would make the list of like the most popular people God could use, and yet God's in her story. And as she becomes then the queen in the nation of Persia, queen to the most powerful king in the world, her uncle Mordecai, a Jew that's living under Persian rule in the city of Susa, begins a battle or a duel with an evil character named Haman. Are you following? So she's now queen. Haman steps in. He's a leader, a Persian leader, and he begins a duel with Esther's uncle, Mordecai. Haman thinks this. He says, I'm pretty well-to-do. I'm pretty popular in the kingdom. I'm going to create a decree that goes something like this. Maybe this is your workplace if you're a boss in town. When I walk by, people bow. I mean, they should, but they don't often. So Haman kind of was that kind of evil. He just said, hey, I'm so important that here's the deal. When I walk by, you need to bow. Mordecai, a Jew, a worshiper of the one true God, said to himself, hey, I only bow to the one true God, Haman. Sorry. If you've ever been in one of these kind of conflicts, they can escalate. This one does. Haman hatches a plan in which all the Jews under the Persian rule in dispersion will be killed. Unless hidden Esther has something to say about it. And so Mordecai sends word to Esther and he says to her, hey, there's a lot going on that you don't see. And there's a God that's woven into our stories, his work and his redemptive purposes. And he leans in to Esther to risk everything, go talk to the king, let him know the plan. We pick up the story in Esther chapter 4 with Mordecai's response. Mordecai's response in verse 13 is this. Esther sends word to Mordecai, hey, that's not legal for me to do. I can't go. So Mordecai writes back in verse 13 his answer. He says this, Esther, do not think that because you are in the king's house, that you alone of all the Jews are going to escape. For if you remain silent at this time, this is fascinating, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. In other words, if you don't step into this time, to this season that God's given you, God is going to prove himself faithful. God is a God that has revealed his plans to the nation of Israel, and he keeps his plans or promises. The invitation, Esther, is for you to step into your time. Verse 14, for if you remain silent at this time, deliverance will come, but your father's family will perish. Probably Uncle Mordecai as well. And then he says these words, and they're on the screen. And who knows? Who knows? Who knows? It's the question that prods our living wise. Who knows? Maybe, Esther, God's been at work. Maybe God has you right here for this time. Who knows? But that you have come to your royal position. I know you didn't see God. You may didn't even think you were following God, but he brought you to this place because he's the author of the bigger story for such a time as this. Esther responds in this way, sent a reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law." Then she says these words, "And if I perish, I perish." If this is what God's directing, it's going to cost. If this is how God has woven his story into my story, I'm all in. I'm to be accountable, to be faithful. It's God who's writing the bigger story. And so she opens herself up and moves in, and eventually God saves the nation through her. A couple things I want us to kind of focus on as a result of this story and what it looks like to live out ours. The first thing I want to encourage us to do, and I think the story does all over the place, is we look for God in the details of our life. Look for God. Where is he showing up? Where is he nudging? Where is he at work? Where is he moving me forward? What does my eye spy? This is one of the most fun things of my position here at the church is I get to hear all kinds of stories, how God is at work doing all kinds of cool things in ways that don't often feel like a burning bush, but they feel a little bit more like, who knows? Maybe that's the nudge of God. Maybe that's the way he's directing. I had such a fun little kind of one of these even this last week as I was literally just walking around my yard praying and whatever, just talking to God. I don't know if you do stuff like that. I encourage you to. And I just felt like a number of names. So I just texted some friends. I said, "Hey, I'm just thinking about you. How are you doing?" And then there was one guy like, "I haven't seen you in a bit. I'd love to connect. How you doing?" Sent back a short text and it just said, "Fine." And after that, I thought, well, all right. I was just checking in. I had no idea. Just God put you on my heart and thought I'd text you. Well, about an hour later, he texted back and he said, "I'm really struggling." We talked yesterday on the phone and, we were talking about his stuff and the life that God's asked him to live. And at one point, the phone conversation pauses. And he's like, "Who told you I was struggling? Why'd you call me?" I was like, "I don't know. Maybe it was God that put it. Maybe God's trying to say, he hasn't forgotten you. Maybe God's trying to say he's got you in this moment. I know it's tough. Maybe God's trying to." And it's like, frankly, I was insanely surprised again because I hadn't at this point written God into the equation at all. It's like, I should reach out to this guy, see how he's doing. And when we do those kinds of things so often, God surprises us because he's already at work. Shocker. That the author would be involved in his story in ways that we wouldn't normally know. So we look for God in the details. We're prepared to be surprised. And then we know, if we're going to do what Paul encouraged us to do, if we're going to live well by the seasons, the time, the kairos that is ours in these moments, it's going to come with a cost. And for Esther, she came to a place of saying, what it looks like for me to trust means I got to be willing to risk the palace. And if this is where God's directing, I'm all in.
Thanks so much for joining us, church. We hope that you enjoyed this message. If you'd like to hear more messages like this, or if you'd like to partner with us financially, please visit sierrabible.com.